Michael Caine arrived at the Loose Women studio that morning, expecting a straightforward interview about his latest memoir. He had spent over 6 decades in the film industry, working with some of the greatest directors and actors of multiple generations. These promotional appearances were routine for him, usually filled with warm reminiscences about his remarkable career and light-hearted anecdotes that delighted audiences. He settled into the bright orange sofa, his hands folded calmly in his lap, ready for what he assumed would be another pleasant conversation about his life's work and the stories he had chosen to share in his book. Denise Welch sat across from him, and there was something in her demeanor that should have served as a warning. Her eyes had a particular gleam, an intensity that suggested this interview might not follow the usual pattern. She leaned forward in her chair, and when she began speaking, her voice carried a false sweetness that immediately put everyone in the studio on edge. She opened with what seemed like a pleasantry, welcoming Michael to the show, but then quickly pivoted to something far more confrontational. She had apparently read his memoir closely, but not with the intention of celebrating his achievements or exploring his insights. Instead, she had clearly been looking for something to attack, some comment she could twist into a controversy. Denise brought up a section of Michael's book where he had made observations about how the acting industry had changed over the decades. He had mentioned that modern actors had different support systems and safety nets than those available when he was starting out in the business. It was a fairly innocuous observation, the kind of reflection that any veteran of any profession might make when looking back over a long career. But Denise chose to interpret these comments as a personal attack on her own work ethic, and that of everyone in television. She asked him directly if he was suggesting that people like her, who worked in television, didn't work as hard as actors of his generation had worked back in the day. Michael's eyebrows raised slightly at the question. This wasn't the tone he had expected, and it certainly wasn't delivered with the professional courtesy that guests typically received on talk shows. He shifted slightly in his seat but maintained his characteristic composure. Years of experience in the industry had taught him how to handle difficult situations with grace and diplomacy. He responded carefully, explaining that he hadn't meant to criticize anyone personally. He was simply noting that the industry had evolved, that when he started out there were fewer support systems in place, and actors had to learn through trial and error, often in difficult circumstances. He made it clear that he wasn't suggesting anyone today worked less hard, just that the environment had changed. But Denise wasn't interested in diplomatic explanations or nuanced discussions about industry evolution. She leaned back in her chair with a smug smile that suggested she had been waiting all morning for this confrontation. She accused him of sitting there in his expensive suit talking about how tough he had it, while dismissing the efforts of people who work every day under intense pressure. Then she took the attack even further, suggesting that Michael had been handed opportunities on a silver platter because he fit a certain look. It was a direct attack not just on his work ethic, but on the legitimacy of his entire career. The atmosphere in the studio shifted dramatically in that moment. The cameramen, the crew, the other panelists, everyone could sense that something had gone terribly wrong. This was no longer an interview. It had become something much uglier. Make it. Elle's jaw tightened, though his voice remained steady when he responded. He told Denise that he believed she had completely misunderstood what he was saying, and he found her tone rather unnecessary. It was a measured response from a man who had decades of experience dealing with difficult personalities, but it was clear that he was surprised by the hostility being directed at him. Denise let out a harsh laugh that echoed through the studio like a challenge. She questioned what Michael meant by calling her tone unnecessary, then launched into a vicious attack on his acting career. She accused him of spending 50 years playing the same Cockney character in different costumes, suggesting that he lacked range as an actor. It was an incredibly insulting thing to say to a guest, particularly one of Michael Caine's stature and accomplishment. The other panelists exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly disturbed by how far Denise was taking this confrontation. This had moved beyond tough questioning or even heated debate. It had become a personal attack on a man who had come to the show in good faith. Michael's hands remained folded in his lap, but there was a new tension visible in his shoulders. Decades of professional restraint were being tested in real time. He spoke quietly but firmly, noting that there seemed to be some confusion. He had come to talk about his book and his experiences, not to be attacked for sharing honest observations about an industry he had been part of longer than Denise had been alive. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered without malice, but it clearly struck a nerve. Denise pounced on his words immediately, pointing at him triumphantly. She accused him of playing the age card, of being just another old man trying to put the younger generation in their place. She said it sarcastically, as if the very idea of respecting someone's decades of experience was somehow offensive. The camera captured every micro-expression on Michael's face as he processed this escalation. Here was a man who had worked with the greatest directors and actors of multiple generations, who had earned universal respect through decades of professionalism and dedication to his craft, being treated with open contempt by someone who seemed to view his presence as a personal affront. Michael responded calmly, pointing out that he hadn't played any cards. He had simply tried to answer her questions honestly, despite the fact that those questions seemed designed more to provoke than to inform the viewers. It was a diplomatic way of calling out what everyone in the studio could clearly see. Denise wasn't conducting an interview. She was conducting an attack, using her position as host to publicly humiliate a guest who had no warning that this was coming. Denise's voice rose as she responded, her professional veneer cracking completely. She said that what provoked her was entitled old men who thought their past achievements gave them the right to dismiss everyone else's struggles. She contrasted his career, characterizing it as swanning around collecting Lifetime Achievement Awards for basically being himself on screen, with her own work hosting a daily talk show. It was an astonishingly disrespectful thing to say, revealing a deep resentment toward Michael that seemed to go far beyond anything he had actually said or done. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael Caine sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. This was a man who had faced down difficult directors, demanding producers, and harsh critics throughout his long career. He had maintained his professionalism through it all, earning a reputation as someone who could handle pressure with grace. But this situation was different. This wasn't professional criticism or creative disagreement. This was personal hostility, disguised as journalism, and it was happening on live television. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was quiet and controlled, but it carried an unmistakable edge of finality. He simply said that he thought they were done. It was a clear signal that he was prepared to end the interview and walk away from this toxic situation. But Denise wasn't finished. She had drawn blood, and she seemed to mistake his restraint for weakness. She told him that they were done when she said they were done, that this was her show and her domain, and he didn't get to walk away just because someone had finally called him out on what she characterized as his outdated attitudes and overinflated sense of importance. Michael's head turned slowly toward her, and for the first time in the interview, viewers could see the full force of his displeasure. This wasn't the twinkle-eyed charmer audiences knew from his movies. This was a man who had earned every ounce of his reputation through dedication and talent, and he was not going to sit there and be diminished by someone who seemed to confuse rudeness with journalism. He questioned her characterization of what she was doing as calling him out. From where he was sitting, he said, it looked like she had used the interview as an opportunity to work through personal issues that had nothing to do with him or his book. The truth of his observation hung in the air like an accusation. Everyone in the studio knew he was right. Denise's behavior had nothing to do with legitimate questions about his memoir or his career. This was about something else entirely, some personal resentment or insecurity that she was taking out on him in a very public way. But Denise was too far down the path of confrontation to back down now. She denied having personal issues, then claimed that her only problem was with people who thought their celebrity gave them the right to look down on everyone else. She accused him of having a superior attitude and a condescending tone, of acting like he was doing them a favor by appearing on the show. Michael's composure, legendary throughout Hollywood for remaining unshakable under pressure, was being systematically tested by a host who seemed determined to turn a routine book promotion into a public execution. The veteran actor leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone that colleagues from his early career would have recognized as dangerous. He repeated her accusations back to her with surgical precision, pointing out that he had been nothing but polite since sitting down. It was Denise who had started the interview with accusations and personal attacks. It was Denise who had been twisting his words and putting meanings into them that simply weren't there. Denise laughed again, but this time the sound was forced, almost manic. She was clearly enjoying the conflict, feeding off the tension she had created. She told Michael not to play the victim, insisting that he had written the book and made the comments, so he should own them and stop pretending to be an innocent party. Michael replied that he was owning his words, but what he wouldn't do was sit there and let her rewrite what he had actually said to fit whatever narrative she had decided to construct. His observations about the industry had been meant to be thoughtful, not divisive. He was trying to maintain reason in a situation that had become increasingly unreasonable. But Denise was emboldened now, convinced that she had the upper hand in this exchange. She turned to the camera with a theatrical gesture, as if appealing to the audience at home. She asked if viewers were really supposed to believe that Michael Caine, who had made a career playing working-class heroes while living in luxury, understood anything about real struggle. The attack was so brazen and deliberately inflammatory that even the production staff behind the cameras could be seen shifting uncomfortably. Michael's face remained impassive, but his knuckles had gone white where his hands gripped the arm of the sofa. Michael responded quietly but firmly. He said he had never claimed to understand everyone's struggle, but he did understand his own. He had grown up in Rotherhithe, a working-class neighborhood in London. He had left school at 15 and worked in factories before ever setting foot on a film set. He had earned everything he had achieved, and he wasn't going to apologize for his success to Denise or anyone else. It was a simple recitation of biographical facts, but it powerfully undermined Denise's attempt to paint him as someone who had been handed everything on a silver platter. Denise's response dripped with sarcasm. She questioned whether Michael had really earned his success, or if he had simply been in the right place at the right time with the right accent. Then she asked if he thought that if he were starting out today with his background, his look, and his attitude, he would even get past the first audition. It was a question designed to hurt, to suggest that his entire career had been based on luck rather than talent or hard work. The question hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, a direct attack not just on Michael's achievements, but on his very identity as an actor. Everyone watching could sense that a line had been crossed, that this had moved beyond professional disagreement into something much more personal and cruel. Michael was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Denise with an intensity that made her shift slightly in her chair despite her bravado. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. He told her that in over 60 years in the business, working with directors who could destroy careers, producers who could make or break dreams, and critics who made their living tearing down everything he tried to build, he had never met anyone quite so determined to diminish another person's life work while they sat right in front of them. For the first time since the interview begged, and Denise seemed momentarily taken aback by the force of his response. But her recovery was swift, and her counterattack was vicious. She questioned his characterization of his career as life work, claiming that he had made the same film 40 times with different titles, that he played Michael Caine in every single role, and shouldn't dress it up as some grand artistic achievement. The insult was so reductive, so dismissive of decades of craft and evolution as an actor, that it left the studio in stunned silence. Michael's jaw worked silently for a moment, as if he were physically restraining words that wanted to escape. He asked if that was her professional opinion, his voice barely above a whisper. Denise shot back that it was everyone's professional opinion, that people just didn't usually say it to his face because they were too polite. But since Michael wanted to talk about honesty and work ethic, she said, they should be honest about the fact that he had been coasting on charm and his accent for decades. It was an incredibly insulting assessment of a career that had included critically acclaimed performances in films across multiple genres and generations. Michael stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. The action sent a ripple of tension through the studio. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every nuance of his expression as he looked down at Denise, who suddenly seemed much smaller in her chair. He spoke in a conversational tone, but somehow that made his words more impactful than if he had shouted them. He told her that the difference between them was that he had spent his entire career trying to elevate the material he was given, trying to find truth in every character, no matter how small the part. She, on the other hand, seemed to have built her career on tearing other people down. Denise's face flushed red, but she wasn't backing down. If anything, she seemed energized by his reaction. She responded sarcastically, mimicking the idea of the great Michael Caine dispensing wisdom from on high. Then she asked him how it felt to know that his best work was behind him, that he was basically a living museum piece now. The cruelty of the comment was breathtaking. She was systematically attacking not just his professional achievements, but his very relevance, his worth as a human being at this stage of his life. Michael's response was to smile, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had finally seen enough, who understood exactly what was happening and why. He asked her if she really couldn't help herself, suggesting that this whole performance and manufactured outrage wasn't about him at all. It was about her need to prove something, to make herself feel bigger by making others feel smaller. It was a devastating psychological insight, delivered with the calm precision of someone who had decades of experience reading people and situations. Denise snapped at him not to psychoanalyze her, her composure finally cracking completely. She insisted that she didn't need to prove anything to anyone, especially not to what she called a has-been actor who thought his knighthood made him untouchable. The use of the term has-been was particularly shocking. Here was a man who was still working, still respected throughout the industry, still in demand for roles, being dismissed as irrelevant by someone who seemed to have lost all sense of proportion. Michael repeated the phrase has been with genuine surprise in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe she had actually said it. He asked if that was really where she wanted to take the conversation, then told her that for someone who made a living talking to people, she seemed remarkably bad at actually listening to what they were saying. The observation hit its mark. Denise's face contorted with fury, and when she spoke again, all pretense of professionalism had evaporated completely. She told him that she had listened just fine, that what she heard was an old man who couldn't accept that his time was over, that nobody cared about his opinions anymore, that he had become irrelevant in an industry that had moved on without him. The words hit the studio like a physical blow. Michael Caine stood frozen for a moment, processing what had just been said to him on national television. Here was a man who had worked alongside Laurence Olivier, who had been directed by Christopher Nolan, who had earned the respect of generations of filmmakers, being told he was irrelevant by a daytime television host who seemed to mistake cruelty for courage. Michael repeated the word irrelevant slowly, as if tasting it and finding it bitter. He told her that he had been called many things in his career, that critics had called his work everything from brilliant to mediocre, and he had accepted their right to their opinions. But what she was doing wasn't criticism. It was something else entirely. There was a weight to his words, a suggestion that he understood this was about something darker than honest assessment or even professional rivalry. Denise leaned back in her chair with her arms crossed, wearing an expression of smug satisfaction. She clearly believed she had won whatever game she thought they were playing. She asked what she was doing if not telling the truth and asking the hard questions that his usual interviewers were too starstruck to ask. It was a thin justification for what had clearly been a sustained personal attack, an attempt to frame her behavior as brave journalism rather than what it actually was. Michael replied that she was being needlessly cruel, and what was worse, she was being cruel while hiding behind the pretense of journalism. She had taken what should have been a conversation and turned it into an ambush, and he suspected the viewers could see exactly what she was doing. It was a powerful accusation, delivered with the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the media landscape and understood the difference between tough questioning and personal attack. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Denise's face. She glanced quickly at the other panelists, who were staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment. The studio audience, usually quick to react to any drama, sat in uncomfortable silence. The lack of support from anyone in the room should have told Denise that she had gone too far, but instead of backing down, she forced another laugh and accused Michael of being defensive and throwing around accusations. She suggested that maybe television wasn't the right medium for him anymore if he couldn't handle their discussions. Michael shook his head slowly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both disappointment and finality. He told her this wasn't a discussion and hadn't been from the moment he sat down. She had come into the interview with an agenda, and that agenda seemed to have been to humiliate a guest who had agreed to appear on her show in good faith. It was a clear and accurate summary of what had transpired, impossible to deny by anyone who had witnessed the exchange. Denise's voice rose again, with desperation creeping in around the edges. She accused him of pretending his appearance was some altruistic gesture when really he had come to sell his book and promote himself. Michael responded calmly that of course he had come to promote his book. That was what authors did, what guests did on shows like this. But he had also come expecting to be treated with basic human decency, and that was where they seemed to have had a fundamental misunderstanding. The truth of his words was undeniable. Everyone in that studio and everyone watching at home could see exactly what had happened. A respected actor had come to talk about his memoirs and found himself subjected to systematic character assassination by a host who seemed to view his presence as a personal affront. Denise's face was now flushed with anger and something that looked suspiciously like panic. She had pushed too far, gone too deep into territory she couldn't navigate her way out of, and on some level she knew it. But instead of backing down, she doubled down once more. She questioned what was decent about coming on the show and looking down his nose at everyone, about acting like he was doing them some great favor by gracing them with his presence. Michael's response was completely unexpected. He smiled, but this time it was genuine, almost pitying. He asked her to listen to herself, to really listen, because what she was saying and the way she was saying it revealed far more about her than it did about him. It was a moment of clarity that cut through all the noise and posturing. The observation landed like a thunderbolt. Suddenly, it was crystal clear to everyone watching that Michael was absolutely right. Denise's attacks, her manufactured outrage, her desperate attempts to diminish him, none of it was really about anything he had said or done. It was about her own insecurities, her own need to prove herself by destroying someone else. The psychological truth of the moment was impossible to miss. Denise snarled at him not to turn this around on her, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Michael asked her quietly if she wasn't the one with the problem, because from where he was standing, it looked like she had invited him specifically to tear him down, and he had to ask himself why. What was it about him, about his success, about his career that bothered her so much that she would sacrifice her own professionalism just to take shots at him? The question hung in the air like an accusation that demanded an answer. Denise opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in the entire interview, she was speechless, confronted with the ugly truth of her own behavior. Michael looked around the studio one final time, his gaze taking in the uncomfortable faces of the other panelists, the mortified expressions of the crew, the stunned silence of the audience. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, dignified, and absolutely final. He said that he had come to talk about his life, his work, and his experiences. He had thought he was going to have a conversation with professionals who understood the basic principles of courtesy and respect. Instead, he had been subjected to what could only be described as a sustained personal attack by someone who seemed to think that being rude was the same thing as being interesting. He paused to let his words sink in, then delivered what would become the most quoted line from the entire debacle. He told Denise that he had worked with some difficult people in his time, but he had never encountered anyone who seemed so determined to make themselves look small while trying to make others look smaller. He said he wouldn't be part of this any longer. And with that, Michael Caine turned and walked toward the studio exit. His movements were unhurried and dignified, the walk of a man who had maintained his integrity in the face of an unprovoked assault. Behind him, Denise sat frozen in her chair, finally understanding that she had just made a catastrophic error in judgment on live television. She called after him weakly, desperately asking him to wait, but her voice had lost all its earlier force. The damage was done, and everyone knew it. Michael paused at the studio door and turned back one final time. He delivered his parting words with the quiet authority that had made him a legend throughout his career. He told Denise that he genuinely hoped she would find whatever it was she was looking for, but she wouldn't find it by trying to destroy other people's reputations. He wished her good luck with the rest of her show, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded like thunder in the deadly silent studio. Denise sat alone with her triumph, which had turned to ashes in her mouth. She had achieved something, but not what she had intended. She had exposed herself rather than him, revealed her own insecurities and unprofessionalism rather than any flaws in his character or career. The cameras kept rolling and the world kept watching as she finally understood that she had just committed professional suicide on national television, all in the name of what she had thought was brave journalism but was actually just cruelty masquerading as honesty.